Hi everyone, today we've got the pleasure of welcoming back at Second Line for an afternoon Henry Moss. That's been working with us for a few years and went his own path at the University of Cambridge, newly appointed at Lancaster University now, and expert in Bayesian optimization in other fields. We're excited to hear about latent space coming back. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Cool. So I'm going to be talking about something called latent space optimization. So it's quite a vague sounding thing, but it's how people so far have typically applied traditional Bayesian optimization methods to optimize over weird spaces. So I'll be very specific about what I mean by weird spaces as we go through. But the idea is that we're going to be largely quite critical here of a lot of existing work, thinking about how you can plug a nice generative model, so that could be a VAE, could be a diffusion model, into something that looks quite like a traditional Bayesian optimization loop. So this is work I've done. A lot of you know Seb, but these are sort of collaborators that helped with this. But please, yeah, do interrupt as we go along. I'll probably say some things that are confusing, so stop me when you need me to. When you want me to stop in general, how long is this meant to take?
You got until 8 p.m.
I'll stop until then, yeah. Cool. Okay, so I've split things up into kind of 3 sections here. This first one probably won't be super exciting for a lot of you, but I wanted to really formalize exactly what I mean by different parts of the Bayesian optimization loop. So I'm going to talk about optimization of what I call highly structured. So this is currently undefined, but I'll get to that. But highly structured spaces. Okay. So at a very, very simple level, Bayesian optimization is essentially this. We're interested in optimizing something. So a function here, we've got a search space. We have an acquisition function, and we have an acquisition optimizer and a surrogate model. So these are all of the moving parts about Bayesian. Something that's kind of helpful at this point would be to think a little bit about how these things would break if we have weird looking search spaces, for example. So we're pretty much always here. Our search space is something that looks a bit like a box, right? It's a continuous variable, a set of continuous variables, and we kind of have free choice over what we can do there. If this search space was instead, say, a set of molecules or a set of other discrete objects, like graphs, for example, things get quite difficult. So firstly, it becomes quite difficult to think of, how do I even build a surrogate model in this space? Acquisition functions are pretty easy. The thing that really kills you is the acquisition optimizer. So normally when we're doing Bayesian, we just rely on nice, easy methods here. But if you're optimizing over molecule space, it becomes very hard to do this. So this is your standard setting here. Shouldn't be sort of surprising to any of you guys, but yeah, very standard here. Standard GP has our surrogate model, a normal sort of RBF prior, for example, for the kernel. And the key thing here is that we can just leverage popular continuous optimizers with or without gradients, and we can do a good job. And I guess this is what a lot of second line stuff is built on. I'm going to go through a few examples here of slightly weird problems that people have tackled in the literature. So applying Bayesian to structured problems. Okay. So here, this is, and it'll become apparent why I've got these kind of weird, horrible AI generated images later on. But this is meant to be kind of people making a cake. So this is you don't look too closely. There's some really horrible things going on in this picture. But this is a problem here where you've got lots of binary decisions, essentially. So like, should it be a chocolate cake? Should it not be a chocolate cake? Should I put in vanilla? Should I not put in vanilla? And there's been some very powerful methods for this sort of problem. So custom designed basically to deal with this weird search space. So you can have a surrogate model here, which is just a Bayesian sort of quadratic model. And it turns out if you do that, you can actually use a very powerful acquisition optimizer, so binary quadratic programming. So you can actually solve this thing very, very quickly and very efficiently. So that's the key thing here. We're going to go through a few of these examples, but we have weird search space means that you have to have a weird model and you have to have a weird acquisition optimizer. So we might also do a mixed space. So this is supposed to be, what was this one? Oh, this was a brewing example. This was for Victor. This was meant to be what AI thinks brewing looks like. So this is where we've got a mixed space. So we've got a mixture here of sort of continuous variables and also binary variables here. So for these sort of problems, people have proposed, and I think Ian came and did a seminar on this paper at some point here in the seminar series. So we have this sort of diffusion kernel, which sort of extends notions of RBF kernels across discrete spaces, but allows you to kind of mix and match here. And the common way to actually maximize this acquisition function, so proposed new points, is hopping between a continuous and a discrete optimizer. Something else that's quite exciting, so this is, again, same guy. Another horrible space you might be interested in is the space of permutations. So this is chip design. So you basically kind of know what you want to put on your chip, you just don't know the order. So you're interested in working out the optimal permutation of things. And again, there's sort of strange surrogate models. I won't go into the details of this now, where you have weird kernels that make sense over this horrible space. And again, you have to propose some sort of quite difficult optimizer here to make things work nicely. There's some of the stuff that I worked on quite a while ago now, and we were interested in optimizing over strings. So we had the same problems here. We had a weird search space that was kind of discrete, but it had variable length, so there were difficulties there. And again, you can come up with a strange model. There's a strange kernel that can measure the similarity between strings, and you can apply some sort of optimizer. I think that's my last example. No, no. One final one. Another thing, SecondMind funded a bit of research here. Here, our search space is strange. Our search space is the set of smooth paths. So we're trying to find an optimal path. So we have to use some strange acquisition optimizers in this setting as well. So we're able to use traveling salesman algorithms or some RL sort of methods to do this. But this is the kind of the idea here, is that what people have done so far is if they have a space that's a bit strange, they try and write down the space mathematically in a way that you're parameterizing all possible. So here, this is kind of all possible inputs here characterized in this way. And you fit an appropriate model and you fit some weird acquisition optimizer. So what I'm interested in this talk are things called highly structured spaces. So what I've showed you so far, I'm going to call them structured spaces. So structured spaces are these ones where we know the structure, we can write it down. A highly structured space is one where it becomes quite difficult to write down the rules of the space. So, for example, in molecule search, we know there are loads of very, very complicated rules about whether a molecule is valid or toxic or that sort of thing. It's very hard to write these down as rules. So that's what I would call a highly structured space. These sort of horrible cake pictures that I had popping up earlier on, so images are also a highly structured space. So we can look at them and we can very quickly tell whether or not it's a valid image. But actually writing down, in a mathematical way that would be amenable to optimization, is this an actual picture of a cake? That's basically impossible to do. So the question is, can we somehow learn what it means to have this structure, and can we then optimize over it? So what people have done so far is something called latent space Bayesian optimization. So the idea is that you actually build a prior over these structured spaces. So what you do is you have your structured space. This will be called Z throughout the talk. And the idea is that you have some sort of mapping that you learn offline that can map. The structured space is X here. So Z is some nicely behaved latent space, but you learn some mapping that goes from nicely behaved latent space into structured space. So for example, this could be mapping vectors in a d-dimensional space to molecules, for example. So this is a very well-established technique. So there's a lot of work here. People have done a lot of this latent space Bayesian optimization. So this is where you want to try and smash together these sort of ideas. So using some sort of prior over molecule space, for example, with one of these more traditional sequential experimental design loops. So what do we have at our disposal? Well, we now have this latent space, and we also kind of have a notion of the distribution of our latent variables in here. So how could we use them to do Bayes opt? So this is what they do in latent space Bayes opt. I'm going to go through this in detail now, but at a high level, we just swap the search space for the latent space. So we're going to do Bayesian optimization in the latent space of a variational autoencoder. And then for our surrogate model, we're now trying to learn a mapping from latent encodings all the way to the objective function. Okay, so this is what latent space Bayesian optimization is. What we're going to propose is that we don't do any of that, and we instead just use some notion about the distribution of the latents to help us optimize our acquisition function. But we'll get to that later on. Do people have questions so far about this setup with the latent space optimization?
What do you mean by this? Just use PZ here?
Yeah, we'll get to that. That's I guess the kind of the new part of all of this is thinking more about the distributions you get here. But this kind of broad idea of you have a VAE and you try and learn a mapping from the VAE to the so that's very much what people are trying to do at the moment. And I'm going to be kind of rude about it a little bit. And you can see Sebastian's been involved in this paper because he likes to talk about promises and pitfalls of things. Okay, so this is what people are doing at the moment. So you set your search space for your Bayes optimization just to be the latent space of your VAE. So this is what you're doing. And what people do, so this is from the original paper. So these algorithms do work very, very well in certain settings. But the premise here is that when you're looking at the property of interest, so this could be kind of some arbitrary property that we're only about to see. We've only got a few data points of this property. The hope is that this pre-trained VAE model, so the latent space of this model, when you move around in this latent space, the objective function moves smoothly. Okay, that's kind of the premise. And if that's true, you can fit a GP and everything's great. So there's this kind of quite misleading figure, I would say, that's often shown in the work. It's this really nice one. So if this is the setting you're in here, so smooth changes in your latent space allow you to get smooth changes in your property, then this can work really, really well. Oh yeah, Alan? You muted.
Is there anything that you can try and do to try and enforce that?
Yeah, so we'll get to this. That's basically the last 3 or 4 years of this literature. There's lots of very complicated approaches where you try and you kind of have the pre-trained embedding sort of viewpoint, and then you fine-tune them to the data set so that your GP model is better. But there's lots of, like, you've got to be very careful doing that, because you're then fine-tuning a big model and a very small amount of data in a way where you're kind of marking your own homework to some extent. You're trying to learn the embedding so that the model is easy, or the model is good, and you can get into kind of nasty feedback loops, which is what we'll see happening.
Okay.
So with this picture, should the smooth function should actually be a bunch of steps?
So kind of, yeah. I guess with the actual it's quite coarse on the bottom, right?
Yeah.
There's stochasticity involved in the decoder, so you might get slightly different things. So this is a little bit misleading. This, like, the idea that there's a single place in Z space that maps the same value.
That would be the case, right?
Yeah, it would be steps for sure. Yeah. There'll be steps in all of this, but the idea is that, I guess, at the level you're interested in, you can kind of have it as smooth.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Cool. But yeah, this is, for many reasons, this is one of them. This is quite a misleading figure, I think.
Yeah.
But this approach can work really well, and it's led to lots of sort of powerful algorithms. But there are settings where this alignment you just have, it's complete garbage, basically. We'll see this in a second. Yeah.
Would you use VAE or this approach for that you say you're reserving for highly structured spaces? Would it be also successful in the structured spaces?
Yeah, so the idea here is that, well, one way you can view this is kind of as a bit of a prior over X, so over your structured space. So if you actually wanted to optimize over all possible molecules, you'd be there all day. You wouldn't make any progress whatsoever. You can kind of view this as, you know, you've trained this VAE on a set of molecules that perhaps you know how to synthesize already. So there's some structure in that. You're kind of warm starting the optimization to some extent. So it's kind of an initial part, a bit of a prior. So you'd have to be careful if you train the VAE for like a standard problem, just the way that you generated the data you used to train the VAE, you might inject some bias in that regard, which could be really useful, but it also could be damaging, I guess. But that is one of the subtleties here, is that there is actually a distribution over the search space implied by these models. Whereas if you looked at the structured examples I had before, you can kind of go anywhere in the search space. Everything is equally likely. There isn't. There's a kind of a disconnect there. So
Yeah, I'm a bit confused about what the VAE, like what molecules get mapped to like the mode of the Gaussian and the VAE versus like the tail. Seems kind of like a strange.
Yeah, so these pictures are all kind of, yeah, we'll get onto exactly what that means as well.
Dimension reduction, it kind of makes sense, or like mapping to some continuous space. But then once there's this Gaussian over it, it seems very strange.
Yeah. There are lots of kind of things that are a bit worrying about it. I agree. Hopefully we'll cover that in a bit. But this is where kind of we're at. This is the vanilla latent space Bayesian optimization. So let's just stress this again. So this is the idea here. We're just focusing here on like a probability of improvement sort of setup here. So we have our surrogate model. These are my kind of two criticisms. So GZ here, so my criticisms, but a lot of other people have also been critical of this. So before we were mapping some f of x, so that was my objective function with respect to my like structured space. So molecules go in as x, and I can predict the energy or the stability. Here, the thing we're trying to learn is the mapping from Z to G. And there's basically this really kind of nonlinear, heavily parameterized neural network that's mapping the two. It's actually stochastic, but let's just suppose that it isn't for now. So you're completely kind of manipulating any notions you have of smoothness in your original space, and there's no guarantee that a GP, makes any sense whatsoever in this space. Imagine I'm interested in, predicting some sort of molecular property that makes sense with respect to the frame of reference of where the atoms are, for example. That would be a very easy thing to model with a GP if you're modeling from like the correct frame of reference. But as soon as you do some sort of strange warping based on some unsupervised data, you completely lose your ability to do that. The other concern, and this is related to your query, is that when you're doing latent space optimization, you're just optimizing over the latent space. So you're trying to find the most likely value Z in a whole kind of unbounded search space or latent space, whereas there are kind of probabilities associated with things. And we'll go into the sort of the weeds of this in a second. But let's focus on this first point to start with, is that G can be much harder to model than F. So this is quite well known, and there are lots of approaches to try and tackle this, but they're all quite complicated and can be quite fiddly. But this is kind of more the sort of thing we see. So this is a paper. This is from a paper of mine from a while ago. We were trying to kind of juxtapose what this nice picture that I showed you before with what can actually happen. So it requires a little bit of unpacking here, but this is a kernel principal component analysis plot. So I've got the first two components from the applying kernel principal component analysis to a GP model here that works directly in the structure space. So it uses a kernel that measures the similarity between graphs. And then I've overlaid on the top the colors for like a particular property that we're interested in. So you see there's a lot of structure in here. The way I interpret this is this is what the GP can see, and this is what the GP can make its predictions based on, basically this sort of structure here. So that's good. If you do the same thing for a VAE that was pre-trained on a very related data set, you get this sort of structure here. So clearly this is going to be much worse for Bayes ops, and this is a much worse model. And you can see that these two very kind of similar molecules have been pushed apart when you pre-train the VAE, essentially. So this is a kind of a useful plot here. These plots here are the same sort of plots, but I've done them for these approaches that Alan was asking about, essentially. So there's a whole host of them. Here's just a subset of them. There's about 10 of them, different approaches where you try and fiddle your VAE based on a small amount of training data you've collected on the task you're interested in. So you can do things like trying to enforce that the mapping between the embeddings and the objective function is like Lipschitz smooth, for example. That's some of these. There's different types of losses in here, contrastive loss. There's a weighted VAE here where you try and just fine tune the weights of the VAE on the new data. And you kind of get into a lot of difficulty here. The key things to look at are that the NLPD, so this is on some data in sample and some data out of sample. You see that these get quite large for some of these sort of fine tuning methods. Okay. So this is, very poor uncertainty quantification. You're able to get, lower error here, but you completely lose your ability to quantify uncertainty. So there's a lot of risks here in terms of Bayes opt. Are you going to be able to use these? Exactly the same point is raised on the right here. So these are the same KPCA plots. So you get these kind of crazy looking things. So the top left is, this nicer model. And then if you start to fine tune your VAE on the small amount of data, you can end up with these sort of plots. So this one on the bottom here, where you do get like very smooth behavior, but everything has been smashed onto this line. And that's just another way of presenting this like lack of ability to do uncertainty quantification, essentially. You can no longer get a good idea of how close points are together. That's the same in these middle plots as well. So that's kind of the problem with a lot of these methods. You super overfit, you lose your predictive uncertainties. It's kind of hard to justify them as being Bayesian optimization algorithms at that point as well.
So this is where all your data points are in the latent space. These
are so the in sample. What do you mean? Sorry, the
plots showing the in the latent space.
Yes, essentially. Yeah. So I push those through the kernel, and then I do sort of KPCA on that kernel. So I'm interested in what my model. So these will be 2 points that I've sampled, from Z. And this is how close the model thinks they are based on what it can pull out from the data. It's quite a weird way of presenting things, this. But it's nice because you can kind of sit within the kernel. This is like one step. It's not just like looking at the latent space. I'm actually looking at what can the GP learn.
And the first PCA component.
Yes, the first two PCA components, But like for a model to be good here, you want kind of smoothness in color, but you also need kind of a decent spread, so you're able to understand uncertainties, essentially. So yeah, it's just a different way of presenting the information on the left. But you get this effect. So some of the work that Seb did before on deep kernel learning, a lot of these approaches actually end up being exactly the same as deep kernel learning. So these are approaches where you have neural networks sat inside kernel functions, and that's the same as this VAE basically. So he shows, that you get this behavior. So we're just kind of corroborating the same thing here. Alan?
I was going to say, if you're just plotting the first two principal components, couldn't there be separation on a third?
Yeah, I guess they could be. But these are,
LR VAE, it could be that there's another dimension where you get the separation that you want, that you need. But I agree that the NLPD suggests that that's not the case, because that accounts for
I guess you couldn't get the. Yeah, I guess you're right. There could be some other effects coming in, but these are like the main ones, right? So it's kind of unlikely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. So the other thing that we're not super happy about is this idea that we have, as a search space, we're kind of blindly saying, okay, search space, let's make that the same as a latent space. So search spaces are normally like 0 to 1 boxes. This is some infinite dimensional Gaussian. Moreover, that actually has a probability measure associated with it. So we know that when we train our VAE, the parts of the VAE and the parts of the VAE latent space that are going to be the best for encoding to reliable molecules are the ones that are going to be close to latent locations corresponding to training points. So they're the areas where P of Z essentially is high. So where the probability, the prior, so the Gaussian prior is going to be high. So there's actually kind of it's a very different shaped space to like a box. So this is what people normally do. You basically shop to a central region because you hope, that's where most of the probability mass is. There won't be too many areas there where things are badly behaved. But you see that even in these settings, some of these VAEs actually, when you kind of decode from areas in these latent spaces, you get very, very small rates of actually generating what we would call a valid molecule or a relevant molecule. So there are kind of nasty parts of these latent spaces. People have done quite complicated things to try and adjust this. People have looked at kind of epistemic uncertainty in the VAE. So this is quite complicated to do, quite expensive. Other approaches have trained other models just to predict whether the thing you're decoding is going to be valid itself. And there's also other approaches using trust regions where you're able to sort of move this space around a bit depending on how things are going. But they're all kind of, to some extent, going to struggle because they're all focusing on these box sort of ideas. But there's this sort of well-known classical theorem, which is very well known and very well used in other types of generative modeling. So in kind of in the broader VAE literature and the diffusion literature, this comes up a lot when you're coming up with ways to manipulate latent variables. And that is that actually for like even just not tiny dimensions, the probability of this Gaussian is actually kind of in this shell, right, which is actually quite far away from the origin. And so these sort of central regions are not the right place to be focusing your search. And what you actually want to do is kind of focus your search perhaps on this annulus, but then you need some sort of weird transformation of your variables. You need a model that makes sense in that space. People haven't tried to do this probably for that reason. But these are the sort of things you could try. But this is the sort of the core idea here. And you see this a lot if you're familiar with like spherical interpolation. All these sort of approaches are designed so you manipulate your latent variables in a way that you kind of maintain the radius of them, and that allows you to sort of stay on these high mass annuluses. So this is what we did. We've got this sort of slightly challenging acronym here, but we just about get to cowboys. We're so close there. If anyone does have any ideas, I would be very happy. We've got another day until we're committed to the title. But yeah, what I do is that we don't bother with the Zs in the search space of the surrogate model. Okay, so we actually don't define a search space. I'll come to what that means in a second. We only use Z to kind of help us propose new points. So VAEs are very much built for sampling. Okay, so VAEs are good. They give us a distribution over X. And for our initial design of our optimization, what we do is we just sample as many random molecules as we want from our VAE. So this is exactly how you would normally use a VAE. For our subsequent steps, we do something slightly differently. I've realized I didn't update the notation here. This is, this is roughly correct. Don't worry too much about what's rendered variables here. But what we then do is we're trying to condition our search. Okay, so obviously if we wanted to, we could just sample from the VAE for all of our optimization process. But then we'd never really do any search. We'd just be randomly generating molecules and hoping we find a good one. But what we want to do is kind of steer our generating process so that over time we get molecules that are higher and higher scoring according to our objective function. Okay. So what we do here is I'll tell you how we do this in a second, but the big idea here is to condition our VAE on extra information that if we were to push that molecule through our Gaussian process model here, we want that to be bigger than a current threshold. So, this is very similar to probability of improvement, essentially. So one way you could think about this is what I'm going to do is like a rejection sampling algorithm. So this would scale really badly, but you could imagine that what I'm going to do for each of my optimization steps is sample like 1 million molecules and throw away all of the ones that my GP model doesn't think are going to be bigger than the best one I've already seen so far. So that's one way this sort of procedure could work, although that would be very, very, very painful and very expensive. But that's the core idea. So here we're just doing sampling from the VAE, and we're using a GP model as a discriminative model. So there's no funny business here where we're fitting GPs inside VAEs and all this sort of stuff. There's no weird interactions. We've got the VAE doing sampling stuff, and then we've got this GP here. The other key thing here is that our GP is actually taking in the structures itself, so we don't have to fit the GP in the latent space. This is a more traditional sort of structured space Gaussian process. So something using like a graph kernel or a string kernel or a Tanimoto kernel. So that's the key thing here. We're never doing any optimization, which is kind of challenging when you're talking about optimizing over infinite dimensional spaces with probability distributions. And our model is over the space we're interested in, not this weird latent space. So yeah, this is horrible. It's quite hard to sample from this, which is why people haven't done it before. But fortunately, people have done a lot of work in sampling from distributions and difficult distributions. And you can see actually that if we go a little bit deeper here, so we have this stochastic relationship, so phi between my latent variables and my structured space. For an individual step of my optimization routine, I can sample a realization of this mapping. So I get deterministic mapping. And then given that mapping, I can sort of push it through here. And I end up with the same thing. So if I've now fixed the mapping from my latent space to my structure space, I can equivalently just sample a Z and then map that back at the end. But the key thing is that we have this sort of shape here. So we're saying we want to generate a latent variable such that G of Z here, which is what we get by pushing this realization of the decoder through our GP model. Let me just pull this apart. It's still quite difficult to understand at this point, but the key thing is that this distribution here, this is a posterior that arises from a high dimensional Gaussian prior and a likelihood that looks like this. Okay, so there's lots of methods from the computational stats literature on sampling from high dimensional priors, Gaussian priors, so we can start to leverage some of them. The interesting thing is actually that this likelihood is basically the same as the probability of improvement from a Gaussian process. So this is tied in quite nicely with Bayesian optimization methods here. So let me go back to this slide. So here I'm interested in sampling an X from this weird distribution at the top. So what I first do for this to get this sample is I sample a particular realization of my decoder. So this makes it deterministic. That then allows me to sample a Z for that realization of the decoder. So you can think of this as kind of like a Gibbs sampling sort of algorithm. And I can use a standard sort of, what we'll see will be a Markov chain Monte Carlo method for this. And then I can map back through this realization of the decoder to get my X. So that's the sampling strategy here to get my variables. I'm not going to go into the details for all of this MTMC stuff, but we're using a mixture of elliptical slice sampling and parallel tempering, which are two well-studied algorithms in this space. So we've got just a couple more slides now. So we have a toy problem just to get things going. So the idea here is that I have generated lots of things that look like this. Okay, so what I do here is I sample a load of Gaussian variables, two-dimensional Gaussian random variables, and I'm ordering them so that there's no crossings from left to right. So I wanted to come up with some data sets here where there are some weird structural constraints, and this is one of them, that you're not allowed to have this sort of crossings. So that would be a valid sample here. And then my objective function for this problem is simply the sum of all of these dots. So the ideal sort of solution to this optimization problem, if we're going to try and optimize f of x here, is to find a shape that's not crossing itself all in the top right corner. Okay, And this is what happens if we use a mixture of these different methods. So you see that Cowboys is able to continually kind of keep getting better here. Partially because it's got a better surrogate model, but also because you're doing this sampling, you're not kind of just moving around in the search space. I can talk more about this afterwards, but I think the more exciting stuff are these slightly less toy problems. So there's this guacamole benchmark suite of molecular optimization problems. This is a slightly contrived plot. So I'm not comparing in this plot against the algorithms people actually use, which are these kind of more complicated ones, but I'm comparing to like the standard latent space Bayesian optimization. I just wanted to get a feel for what's going on here. And we're comparing against a few different methods. It's a bit weird because these existing methods, you see they run for a huge amount longer. So I was interested to see, how long did I have to run before I was able to match the performance? We didn't get there. So these black and the purple here on the left are what happens if we use our method. So you see we're crazy fast compared to some of these latent space Bayesian optimization methods. This is a more fair comparison, I would say. So these are, again, loads of different methods where they're doing this fine-tuning of the VAE as the optimization progresses. There's a very promising method, which is this black one. This came out a couple of months ago, called inverse Bayesian optimization. But these all rely on, as I said, fine-tuning the VAE on the data as it comes in. And that can be difficult. It can break quite often. Whereas our approach, we're just using the VAE as it was given. We're just kind of not trying to fit a GP in the middle of it. And you see that we're able to get kind of much improved sample efficiency. There is a subtlety here as well that we're only interested, well, I've only presented results here for quite small budgets. So we find that if you're in a large budget setting, so often, the algorithms are tested in this sort of regime, 80,000 to 100,000 molecules, it is worth doing some of these approaches where you can fine tune the VAE. You have enough data there that you can start to actually get a VAE that's more useful to your particular problem. And they do better than our approach where we don't do any fine tuning. But certainly in the small data regime, we seem to be doing very well. But I'll leave it at that. Yes. So these are the two key things. So we're never really optimizing in a latent space, which is kind of a problematic thing to think about. We're actually doing sampling instead. And we're very much thinking about what is the geometry of this latent space before we fit our models. Okay. I'll leave it at that.
What's the first question?
So you said that's you criticized the geometry of VAE, saying that everything is clutched into one line, which prevents the certain quantification. Could you elaborate it? I don't get it.
Sure, it's just quite a difficult plot, this one, to unravel. So this isn't the latent space of the VAE. This is what happens if I apply an RBF kernel to the latent space of the VAE and then look at what my GP is able to think about things. So you want something that looks like this, really. You want some sort of structure. So the GP would be able to pick out that there is some sort of structure. I'd be able to predict that a new point that lies down here is going to be very brightly pink, for example. But I have a good understanding of how close that is to lots of my different data points that I've observed. So I can get a good estimate of the uncertainty. Here, everything collapses down. So I could say, okay, if I get a new point here, I'm pretty sure it'll be pink. But it's very hard for me to get good uncertainty estimates because my model is unable to work out if there are lots of points close to it or not, essentially. And this corresponds to these kind of NLPD values going up to be very, very large along here.
I see. So are these colors to represent the scores or?
Yeah, so this is like a particular objective function that we're interested in.
I see.
So these have been VAEs that have been optimized again on a small data set from that objective function, basically.
I see.
So yeah, where the idea of this work was just to somehow be able to include, we have a P of X, which is a distribution over molecules that we think are reasonable. How can we use that to help guide a search strategy? And we wanted to keep those two things separate. And it seems to work. In low data, it works well. Whereas these approaches are just very fiddly and, a struggle in the low data regime. But it's quite a natural way to think about things, I think. And we've been doing the same with some diffusion sort of models as well. But this sort of setting here where, you've got some generative distribution over your search space. I want to, over time, change my generating distribution using some discriminative model. This is just Bayes' rule. You can smash them together, and then you do have to do some fiddly computational statistics stuff. But there's no kind of weirdness. You're not fitting a model in a latent space. You're not moving around a latent space. It doesn't look like Bayesian optimization from here because there's no acquisition optimization and that sort of stuff. But you could imagine doing this for a generic Bayesian optimization problem. Perhaps P of X is just a uniform distribution over a box. You could still do exactly the same thing. You could now sample. What this would boil down to would be sampling from a probability of improvement acquisition function. So you can imagine calculating the probability of improvement across my search space, sort of standardizing it so it became a distribution itself, and just sampling from that. So that is kind of one of the things we say, like the negatives about this algorithm is that it's kind of, we're sampling from a probability of improvement rather than maximizing a probability of improvement. You would have think that it'd be more sample efficient to, pick the thing that actually is the best. So that's one criticism, I guess. The advantage, though, is that this gives you can have arbitrarily many samples out of this. This can be parallelized as much as you want. So that's an interesting avenue of future work is sampling from an acquisition function a better thing to do than maximizing it in what settings and that sort of stuff. It's also, everything is probability of improvement based, and we know that probability of improvement isn't always a very good algorithm. So that's another.
No, but sampling from it would be very close to doing Thompson sampling.
Yes.
Yes, it's unclear exactly what the link is, but there is for sure a similarity.
Similar, but yeah. So generally speaking, I think you lost me. Is like the general VAE approach is you have a horrible space, you move to happy space. Happy space means you can use your GP or whatever you like. You do everything in happy space. Then you go back to original space to get your data, and you do. But you're not doing any of these here.
No. So that I disagree with the idea of it being a happy space. I guess that's my
happy for GP.
Happy for GP in terms of the inputs, but then the actual mapping is really, really challenging for it to learn.
Yeah.
So here we're not doing any of that. So what you need to do to be able to, work in these settings, you need to tie the VAE and the GP in some way. We're just proposing a different way to tie them together, trying to use it. I think, the way to think about this, just to get intuition, is to think of it as a rejection sampling sort of method. So for my next step, I could sample, 1 million molecules from my VAE, but then I only keep the ones that my GP thinks is going to give me a value better than what I've already seen. So that algorithm doesn't scale, but it gives you a feel for what we're doing here. So you could think of it as two separate parts, this optimization routine. I have something that proposes a large set of candidates, so that's the VAE, and then I have something that chooses which one of those I actually go away and evaluate. So you've got this kind of proposer and chooser sort of split. So you've got VAE and a GP doing each of those separately. And we know VAEs are good at sampling stuff. And we know GPs are good at choosing stuff. So it makes a lot of sense to do that. In the VAE-based opt approaches, everything is sort of wrapped around each other and fine-tuned, and you kind of get, in some sense, the worst of both worlds.
So then issue you have here is your teaching a GP in a challenging space. Still, you're not getting away from that.
So I think that's a misconception. I think certainly in small to medium domains, like amount of data, if you look, there's loads of papers where people have applied, carefully crafted chemical-based kernels, like graph kernels, all these sort of things. And they do so much better when it comes to uncertainty quantification, and often, mean predictions as well for those problems. So I don't think there's too much of an issue. I'm quite keen on these sort of structural kernels and structured spaces. So yeah, you do need to be able to do that.
And in the examples you showed, did you use good kernels for those?
Yes. So I used Tanimoto kernels for these ones. So these were where you look at the largely graph-based similarity metric for the kernel. So it feels a little bit old school, but these are things that work really well.
Somehow combine this like handgraphic kernel with this VAE style, like VAE latent space somehow represents the lower dimensional version of this handgraphic kernel. Is it possible direction?
Yeah, I've not thought too much about that. You could imagine, you mean trying to emulate what it was learning, and then fit an RBF. Yeah, presumably you could do something somewhat like that. I think you still have this issue with, so I didn't really stress it too much in this talk, but when you're doing the VAE optimization, the optimization in the latent space for your acquisition optimization, you quite often just go into regions of the latent space. That's what this picture I stole from another paper is doing here, where you just decode some just nonsense, essentially. So, you see this, as soon as you leave the data manifold in your VAE, there's no guarantee that the stuff you get makes any sense. It's not like it's not a Bayesian model. There's no notion of uncertainty or anything. It just starts giving you garbage. So that's the problem, I guess. You would still have that sort of problem.
I see.
So as you were on that other slide, it was you don't actually even have a latent space at all when you're like formulating this rejection sampling way. But then I think maybe I missed, but do you use the latent space to efficiently sample?
Yes, yeah. So I mean, I guess that's a valid point. I'm never like moving around and optimizing over a space.
Yeah.
But I do happen to go in there just because it then means I have like a Gaussian prior essentially, and I can use the Gaussian some of the methods. Yeah.
Sampling.
But that's I'm treating it as a latent variable rather than like a search space, which is quite natural.
No.
But it gets a bit hairy, some of the MCMC stuff, but that's been quite fun.
Does it allow it? So what, if I remember correctly, one problem, for example, with molecular search of molecular space is it's really huge, and typically what's known is like one small pocket, but you really want to go potentially very far.
Yeah, I guess that's
So
a debate to be had.
Even this, I mean, if your learned VAE is still about that very distant part that you know, so you know nothing about like the very distant chemistry that is somewhere in the other corner. Can you? I mean,
no chance.
Can you extrapolate?
No, but that's none of these methods can. Basically, you're always limited to what your VAE can do. There are some arguments for these fine-tuning methods of the VAE that maybe you can start.
Right. So there, if you
it's not super
explore
convincing.
Boundaries, then you might be actually learning some new chemistry, right?
But then I think, so these methods are good when you have like you kind of warm starting optimization. You have a large set of label molecules that unlabeled molecules you train your VAE on. You're good to get going there. I think you'll see like a mixture of these and more traditional approaches, like for these sort of problems. So if you come up with like mechanistic ways to like, a genetic algorithm, for example, where you kind of add arbitrary things to your molecule and you can try different things, you'd need a mixture of the two. A competing line of work is RL-based optimization for molecules. So here we're interested in models that can predict, oh, here's a new molecule, how good would it be? The RL-based approaches are more, you're trying to learn like the effect of doing something. So like, oh, whenever I've added this atom onto my molecule, it's got better. So I'm going to keep doing that. So you're kind of learning direction. So it's more of like a relative thing you're learning, whereas here it's like an absolute thing. So I think in those sort of settings, there's perhaps more scope to go like out of domain as well. But it's a good question. People are talking much more about this sort of thing. They want to go for like new therapeutics, want to be looking at, I don't know, snippets from perhaps non-human like DNA and things, right? And they're definitely not in our training data.
In terms of sampling, so how scalable that is? I mean, I guess with VAE you can kind of keep your dimensionality of your latent space fixed, so you're not particularly concerned about that.
Yeah, and you can batch it as much as you want. That's very easy. The MCMC stuff can be a little bit expensive, but the issue you have is that I don't have a picture for it, but for us to evaluate our likelihood when we're doing our MCMC, we actually have to push something through the VAE. So if your VAE was very expensive, that could be a problem. Typically, they're not that expensive. But suppose I'm going to do, say, 100 MCMC steps. I'd have to push 100 molecules sequentially through my VAE. Whereas for the latent space-based ops, you're never actually touching the VAE until you've chosen your point. So there is a difference in cost there, especially if the VAE would be very expensive. But it's not held us back too much. So, yeah, I think the MCMC, the methods we've got, they're actually pretty quick and nice for these problems, I would say. Not much slower than acquisition optimization. Initially, I was a bit worried. I've never really used much of them before.
Do you train VAE to produce the sample towards the high rewarded samples, or is it fixed or
That's what these people do. That's what these sort of approaches do. So you're able, if you do those sort of approaches, you can get models that are powerful, but you're making, it's very hard to do that in a way where you don't kind of trash your uncertainty estimates.
But but still you can select your samples by Bayesian sampling by your GP, right? Is it?
So you mean fine tuning the VAE on new data or
on new data, and so that's the proposal distribution gets better and better over the time.
Yes. So I mean, that's what, for example, this weight retraining does. That's exactly that sort of idea. But there seem to be issues in that. It's quite unstable. You can kind of wreck your VAE's ability to propose good things by focusing on limited regions, and it's just not obvious. And the fact that there are so many different approaches for it kind of suggests that it's not obvious the best way to do this.
So VAE is then kind of very sensitive to IID violation, or
Yeah, I think so. But these are all the concern we have with these. It's basically the same as the concern that people have with this deep kernel learning. It's where you're trying to wrap a very, very overly parameterized model with a lot of capability within a Bayesian model that's, and then after not very long, you'll end up with the neural network doing all the heavy lifting, and the GP not having to do anything, so there's no uncertainty anymore. But again, there are lots of interesting, a lot of these do work reasonably well. I've kind of picked some bad examples here, but there are settings where these do work really well if you set them up right. And it's, a lot of them have got kind of loss functions that are a mixture of your VAEs, reconstruction loss, and then something else, and you have to choose what proportions to use, and there are subtleties there.
any question online?
I'm wondering if you can push a bit further. So instead of sampling from this quality of improvement distribution, which is a bit unsatisfying, you can have approximate methods to sample from the distribution of the maximum. So Thompson sampling, but not quite, because it's an approximation to Thompson sampling.
So you'd want to be
That would be
sampling.
more I don't know.
So I want to X such that f of X is the maximum or something.
So follows the
Yeah, I've not thought about that. We were trying to work out how we could do an expected improvement sort of version, but there was no natural way, because that's kind of an integral of a probability. There was no natural way to sort of shoehorn it into this shape. But perhaps what you described, basically anything you can write as a condition here would work.
You just apply exponential to the lambda times that probability, so that if you increase your lambda, you just your probability gets higher in the maximum. So that's more closer in the deterministic probability. But you have the higher rejection.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, actually, no, that's
Interesting.
yeah, that's a good idea. I think there are certainly more things to be done here. We're trying to fiddle around with some kind of regret proofs as well for just this generic idea of what happens if, rather than maximize an acquisition function, we kind of sample proportionally to it. We're interested in the limit. Are they intrinsically different performances? Obviously, if you kind of got a crappy model, you'd think the sampling one would perhaps work out quite well, but it's interesting.
For the proof, you're probably going to be in trouble because as you're towards the limit, your GP is exactly known, probability is 0, except if you infinitesimally next to the maximum is going to be 50%, and then it's back to 0 again. So I don't know how sampling from this distribution.
Obviously, sampling is hard, yeah,
and,
but optimizing it is also hard.
yeah, but I don't think it will converge. It's my point. Asymptotically, I don't think it can converge. Maybe I get it wrong.
Yeah. We think it does, but yeah, let's talk about this in a second. Yeah.
What was the acronym again?
Cowboys. I've got another slide of it actually.
Yeah.
There we go. That's Return of the Latent Space Cowboys. That's what we went for. And that's what we got if we pushed that through DALI, I think. So, Jamiroquai song, kind of. Yeah. I thought everyone knew Jamiroquai, but it's just an English thing, it seems. Yeah. All my American colleagues didn't know what it was. But you don't.
I think you'd be too young to know Jamiroquai.